The morning I discovered the missing money, the office smelled like burnt coffee and paper dust, the kind that settles into the back of your throat and stays there. I remember staring at the vendor ledger, blinking hard, thinking the numbers had blurred or I was more tired than I realized. But when the columns refocused, the truth remained exactly where I'd left it. 6 vendor accounts that should have been dormant were suddenly very alive, each showing steady payments, small at first, then bold, careless, and greedy. The total sat at the bottom like a stone dropped into still water. $180,000. It was the kind of number that stops the breath in your lungs and makes you look over your shoulder, as if the room itself has just witnessed something it shouldn't have. I didn't panic. I didn't call out. I simply pushed back my chair and let the ledger rest open, almost inviting the truth to spill further. For a few long seconds, the office hummed around me, printers shaking, and in turn laughing too loudly down the hall, someone dragging a box across the floor. But all of that dissolved the moment I recognized the handwriting on the authorization forms. It wasn't just familiar. It was personal, and it struck me with the same sharp clarity as a name carved into wet cement. My father. He had always signed with that slightly leaning script, the tale of the "are looping just a little too far," a habit he picked up decades ago and never bothered to correct. I traced it with my thumb, stunned by the simplicity of the betrayal. There wasn't even an attempt to disguise it, no forged initials or altered signatures. Just my father, siphoning money through accounts he thought no one would ever look at. I closed the ledger gently, as if afraid to bruise the truth now that it had finally shown itself. My pulse was a slow, heavy drumbeat, and I could feel the weight of the discovery tightening around my ribs. The company's annual audit was only 3 weeks away. If I spoke now, the fallout would be immediate, violent, and messy. If I waited, the auditors would find what I already knew, and my father would be forced to face the consequences with no way to bury them. I sat back and exhaled. I realized that sometimes the most powerful revenge is the one where you don't move a single piece on the board. You just let the truth walk itself to the right doorstep. And this truth was about to walk straight into my father's hands. But before I tell you how everything unfolded, how the audit shattered relationships, exposed secrets, and forced a reckoning none of us were prepared for, you need to understand who I am, and how a daughter like me learned to confront a father who believed he could steal without ever being seen. What happened next didn't start with the missing money. It started long before that, in a life shaped by loyalty, disappointment, and a quiet determination I didn't yet know I possessed. And it ends with the moment my father read the report I allowed to land directly in his lap. My name is Evelyn Rourke, and I turned 62 years old last spring. At an age when many of my friends are easing into gardening hobbies or debating which coastal town to retire in, I've found myself navigating a different kind of landscape. One where loyalty is weighted against truth, and where family history can feel heavier than any ledger I've ever audited. I've spent over 4 decades in the world of accounting, a career chosen not because it was glamorous, but because numbers made sense in ways people rarely do. Numbers don't hide their motives. They don't pretend to be something they aren't. And when something goes missing, numbers leave a trail. I live alone now in a small, tidy house with creaking floors and a garden that insists on surprising me with wild mint every spring. My husband passed away 8 years ago, and though grief softened with time, it left behind a certain clarity. Life is too short to tolerate deceit, especially from people who believe your loyalty is guaranteed simply because your blood matches theirs. My father's name is Marcus. He's 84, retired in theory but meddling in practice. He founded the family business when I was a child, and I grew up watching him stride through life as if every room were waiting for him to take control of it. He wasn't cruel, not in obvious ways, but he carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed rules were suggestions meant for other people. I admired him when I was young, tolerated him in my 30s, and learned to brace myself by the time I turned 50. I never expected to work in his company, not after the two of us clashed repeatedly about ethics, ambition, and the small matter of him believing emotions were a distraction. Yet somehow, life carried me there like a current, especially after my husband's death. Routine steadied me, and the company, despite its imperfections, gave me purpose. By the time I reached my 60s, I had become the unofficial backbone of the financial department. People trusted me. They relied on my intuition, my diligence, my calm scrutiny. My father saw me as both an asset and an inconvenience. He valued my competence, but not my independence. and he certainly didn't value my ability to see patterns he hoped would remain invisible. I tell you all this because stories like mine don't begin with explosions. They begin with slow-building pressure, with years of small choices that stack quietly until one day, the structure can't hold anymore. The day I found the hidden vendor accounts wasn't merely a betrayal of the company. It was the unraveling of a belief I had clung to for most of my adult life. That my father, for all his flaws, would never cross certain lines. I was wrong, and discovering that truth set into motion events that changed everything, not only for him, but for me too. Before the auditors uncovered what I had already seen, before my father's face drained of color as he held the report, there was a lifetime of family tension quietly simmering beneath the surface. That tension is what made the betrayal cut so deeply. That tension is what shaped the way I chose to respond. But family stories are rarely simple, and ours was no exception. Growing up, our family operated like a small kingdom with my father as its unchallenged ruler. He wasn't loud or volatile, but he possessed the firm, unwavering certainty of a man who believed his decisions were always right. My mother, gentle and artistic, orbited him like a moon, soft light around a fixed, immovable planet. My younger brother, Daniel, inherited our father's charm and his tendency to bend truth into whatever shape suited him best. I was the outlier, the one who watched from the edges, dissecting dynamics the way some children memorize constellations. Our father valued usefulness. If you contributed to his goals, you were appreciated. If you didn't, you were dismissed. My mother's quiet loyalty made her indispensable, while Daniel's charisma entertained my father enough to excuse his irresponsibility. I, meanwhile, became the practical one, the organizer, the mediator, the daughter who made sure the family functioned when the two dominant personalities inevitably clashed with something bigger than themselves. When I joined the company later in life, the family hierarchy seeped into the workplace. My father and Daniel occupied high offices, corner windows, leather chairs, while I worked my way upward from the accounting department. My father insisted it would build character. In truth, I think he wanted to keep me at a distance from any decisions that mattered to him. Numbers were safe. Numbers didn't confront him. But even from that distance, I kept the family business running smoothly. When cash flow staggered, I found the solution. When vendors complained, I soothed them. When Daniel fumbled yet another project, I quietly salvaged it. I wasn't thanked. Praise wasn't our family's currency. What we traded in instead was obligation, silent, heavy, and often one-sided. Over time, I noticed my father relying more on me than he ever acknowledged. He trusted my work, but not my voice. He would ask for my analysis, then discard the parts that didn't fit his intentions. He wanted competence, not challenge. And I provided it for years, partly out of habit, partly out of hope that one day he'd look at me the way he looked at Daniel, with pride tinged by indulgence. But that moment never came. As he grew older, his ego hardened into something brittle. He refused to step back. He micromanaged departments he no longer understood. And he dismissed anyone who hinted that his judgment wasn't infallible. I watched him become suspicious of the very people trying to protect the company, yet blind to his own missteps. When my mother passed away, the fabric holding our family together thinned dramatically. Grief softened Daniel for a brief period before he slipped back into entitlement, while my father became more controlling, tightening his grip on the company as if losing my mother meant he needed to anchor himself somewhere else. And then there was me, steady, dependable, and increasingly invisible. So when I discovered the missing money, it wasn't merely a financial discrepancy. It was the culmination of a lifetime navigating a man who believed he was beyond consequences. The discovery wasn't just shocking. It was personal. And part of me knew, even in that first moment of clarity, that this time I wouldn't step in to protect him. Not again. I didn't stumble onto the theft by accident. It began with something small, a vendor payment that didn't align with the usual pattern. It should have been a 5-year inactive account, yet there it was, recently billed and paid. Not an alarming amount, but enough to irritate the part of my brain that treated financial inconsistencies like splinters. Tiny, painful, impossible to ignore. I traced it back through our payment system, expecting some clerical error or misfiled invoice. Instead, I found a digital authorization attached to my father's login credentials. At first, I assumed it was a mistake. He was notorious for forgetting passwords, locking himself out of the system, or calling me to fix whatever the computer has decided to do today. But the more I looked, the more I realized there was nothing accidental about it. 5 more dormant vendor accounts had been quietly revived over the past year. Small payments sent every few weeks, routine enough to blend into the background noise of the company's operating expenses. But together, those payments told a story of deliberate intent. The amounts gradually increased, boldness growing in parallel with my father's belief that no one was looking closely. $180,000 had been siphoned out under the guise of maintenance contracts and consulting fees that never actually existed. I went cold. Not angry, just cold. The kind of cold that spreads slowly, numbing shock into something sharper. I wanted to deny it. I wanted to believe some employee had gained access to his credentials, or that Daniel had finally crossed a line so severe, even he couldn't talk his way out of it. But the audit trail was meticulous, unmistakable. Every authorization matched my father's behavioral patterns. The time of day he usually worked, the phrasing he favored in notes, even the way he categorized expenses. He hadn't been framed. He had hidden the money. Carefully. Consistently. Quietly. And worst of all, he had relied on me, his daughter, the company's most trusted financial guardian, to never question him. For a long moment, I sat in my office staring at the screen, remembering the ways he'd dismissed my concerns over the years. The times he brushed aside my advice. The way he'd criticized my caution, calling it fear masquerading as diligence. Now I realized he hadn't respected my vigilance because he feared it. And he had good reason to. I printed everything. Every ledger, every signature, every audit trail. I placed them in a folder and slid it into my locked drawer, not to hide the truth, but to preserve it. By then, I knew exactly what I would do. I wouldn't confront him. I wouldn't warn him. I wouldn't protect him by cleaning up the mess he created. The auditors were coming in 3 weeks. And for the first time in my life, I would let them see everything. That decision didn't feel like vengeance at the time. It felt like clarity. But clarity has a way of becoming power, especially when someone who has always been untouchable finally meets a truth they can't outrun. Once I accepted the truth, my mind shifted into a mode I knew well. Methodical, calm, relentlessly precise. Emotional turmoil is dangerous in accounting. It clouds judgment, weakens decisions. So I did what decades of training taught me to do. I separated feeling from fact, locking the former away so I could examine the latter with absolute clarity. I began by reconstructing the timeline. Every unauthorized vendor transaction, every login session, every signature. I assembled evidence the way an archaeologist brushes dust from bones. Carefully, respectfully, making sure nothing is disturbed or misinterpreted. This wasn't merely about confirming my father's actions. It was about ensuring that when the auditors traced the path themselves, the truth would stand on solid ground. Next, I reviewed internal security logs. Most people overlook them. They're tedious, dense with data. But they tell the story of every keystroke. My father's digital footprint was unmistakable. He had used the same outdated habits he always relied on. Saving passwords in plain text, logging in from the same device, performing actions at predictable times. He had hidden money with the confidence of a man who believed he would never be questioned. But there was something else. Something that made me pause. The payments stopped 2 months earlier, abruptly, without explanation. As if he sensed the auditors sharpening their pencils. Or maybe, as much as I hated to admit it, he was losing his edge. My father had always been sharp, almost painfully so. But occasionally, in recent months, he'd forget small things, names, dates, turning off the stove. I wondered if this theft had been his desperate attempt to regain control somewhere, anywhere. Or maybe he simply believed he was entitled to the money he helped build decades ago. I refused to let pity cloud the reality. Intentional theft is intentional theft. Still, I needed to ensure the company was protected. So I scheduled a confidential meeting with a corporate attorney I trusted, someone ethical, discreet, and unafraid of complicated cases. I laid out the documents carefully, watching his expression shift from curiosity to concern to unmistakable gravity. When he finally leaned back, hands folded, he asked the question I had avoided forming in my own mind. "Do you want to pursue this legally, Evelyn?" My heartbeat slowed. "Not yet," I said. "I want the auditors to see the truth first. I want the process to be clean." He nodded. "Then you've done everything right." Before leaving, he offered one last piece of advice. Don't interfere. Not even to clarify. Let their methods uncover the truth organically. It will protect you. I took his words to heart. From that moment on, I stepped back. I didn't alter files. I didn't add notes. I didn't give hints. The evidence sat quietly within the system, waiting. And the auditors, known for their precision and lack of sentiment, would follow the trail exactly the way I had. As the days counted down, my father remained oblivious, walking through the office with the same confident gait he'd carried for decades, unaware that every step was taking him closer to a reckoning. I did not warn him. I did not soften the blow. I simply prepared myself for the moment the truth would finally stand in front of him, undeniable and complete. And that moment arrived sooner, and more dramatically, than even I expected. The week before the audit began, I watched my father in a way I never had before, not as a daughter seeking approval, but as a woman evaluating a man whose decisions were about to collide with the real world. He was cheerful, oddly so, humming as he moved through the office. He left papers scattered wherever he worked, confident someone else would sort them later. He spoke grandly about upcoming partnerships, strategies he hadn't fully thought through, and ideas that sounded more like wishful thinking than business planning. But what struck me most was how fragile he suddenly seemed beneath all that bravado. A king pacing in a castle he didn't realize was already under siege. For a moment, just a moment, I felt a tug of sympathy. This was the man who taught me to ride a bike, who placed a firm hand on my shoulder when I got my first job, who praised my handwriting even when he dismissed everything else I offered. But sympathy is not a shield for accountability. And I had spent a lifetime cushioning the consequences of his decisions. Not this time. The turning point arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning. The auditors were due the following Monday. I sat alone in my office while water roared against the windows, and I realized something painfully simple. If the auditors uncovered the theft, and they would, my father's instinct would be to blame someone else. Maybe me. Maybe the department. Maybe an imaginary hacker conveniently operating at the exact hours he logged in. He would resist responsibility the way he always had, forcefully, shamelessly, and with absolute conviction. That was the moment I understood the truth of what I was doing. This wasn't passive. It wasn't merely stepping aside. This was an active choice to stop being the buffer that protected him from the consequences of his own behavior. Justice wasn't cruelty. Justice was truth allowed to speak for itself. And if I didn't let the truth speak now, it never would. I thought of my mother, her softness, her quiet endurance. She spent decades smoothing his edges until she wore herself thin. I wasn't going to repeat that legacy. I owed it to her, and to myself, to break the pattern she couldn't. So I stood up, crossed to the filing cabinet, and opened the drawer where the evidence sat. The folder looked ordinary, blue cardstock, slightly worn, but the weight of it felt monumental when I lifted it into my hands. I didn't take it to my father. Instead, I carried it to the secure review room where the auditors would begin their work. I placed it on the table in plain view, labeled and indexed exactly as their procedures required. It wasn't sabotage. It was transparency. And transparency, when someone has lived in shadows long enough, is the most powerful confrontation of all. When I left the room, I didn't look back. I knew the next time I saw my father, the world he controlled so tightly would already be cracking. And I felt no guilt, only resolve. The auditors arrived on schedule, 3 professionals in gray suits, carrying laptops and neutral expressions. They greeted employees politely but without warmth. Auditors aren't there to be liked, and they don't pretend otherwise. I stayed deliberately quiet, answering only what I was asked, offering no extra guidance. They found the discrepancies within the first 2 days. What began as faint curiosity turned into focused intensity. They whispered among themselves, tapping keys rapidly, tracing patterns they hadn't expected to uncover. I could tell by their expressions that the scope of the problem was far larger than they'd assumed. By Wednesday afternoon, they requested a meeting with my father. He walked into the conference room, confident as ever, unaware that the ground beneath him was about to shift. I watched through the narrow window in the hallway. I told myself I was only passing by, but the truth is I needed to witness it, not out of cruelty but closure. The lead auditor slid the packet across the table. My father's posture shifted barely a millimeter, just enough to betray that he sensed something was off. He opened the report casually, then froze. His eyes narrowed. His fingers tightened. His face drained of color so slowly it was like watching a photograph fade. For the first time in my life, I saw him without his armor. He tried to speak, pointing at the pages, shaking his head, but the auditors remained calm, firm, unshaken. They had documentation for every transaction, every login, every digital breadcrumb he'd carelessly left behind. His voice grew strained, his gestures sharper. He reached for explanations that wilted before they left his mouth. He wasn't used to being challenged. He wasn't used to being wrong. And he had certainly never been forced to face consequences by people who owed him nothing. At one point, he looked up, searching the hallway, and his eyes landed on me. I held his gaze. I didn't smile. I didn't look away. I offered him the same neutrality he had offered me for most of my life. He seemed to understand everything in that moment. That I had known. That I had chosen not to save him. That the truth was bigger than his pride. When the meeting ended, he walked out slowly, shoulders slumped, the report clutched in his trembling hands. His confidence, so vast, so unshakable, had evaporated. The board was notified. Emergency meetings were scheduled. His access to the financial system was revoked immediately. A lifetime of authority dissolved in a single afternoon. There were no dramatic confrontations. No shouting. No accusations hurled across the office. His downfall was silent, steady, and absolute. The kind that leaves a person alone with their reflection, forced to acknowledge what they've done. And for the first time, he had no one to blame. Not even me. Especially not me. In the days that followed, the company moved with the quiet efficiency of a well-practiced emergency response. Systems were secured. Statements were issued. Control shifted to a temporary executive team who understood the gravity of restoring trust. Employees whispered in corners, careful not to speak too loudly, but unable to contain their shock. My father stopped coming into the office altogether. He retreated to his house, a once grand place that felt cavernous without my mother's warmth. I visited him only once after the audit was complete. Not out of obligation, but out of something gentler. Maybe curiosity. Maybe closure. He sat at the kitchen table when I arrived, staring at a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. The air smelled faintly of dust and citrus cleaner, like a house trying to pretend it was still alive. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, he was still broad-shouldered despite his age, but diminished in a way that had nothing to do with stature. When he finally spoke, his voice was thin. "Did you know?" There was no anger in the question. Only weariness. "Yes," I said. A long silence settled between us. He nodded slowly, absorbing the answer without protest. "I suppose I thought you would protect me." The admission struck me harder than I expected. Not because it was true, but because he said it without shame, as if my lifelong loyalty were something he had been entitled to. "I protected you for many years," I replied. "More than you realize. But this wasn't mine to fix." His gaze drifted toward the window, where sunlight moved across the floor in long, golden stripes. "I didn't think anyone would look," he murmured. "I did," I said softly. "You just never expected me to act." He blinked, and for a moment, he looked like an old man finally confronting the weight of the choices he'd carried in secret. Choices that had caught up to him when the one person he believed was safely under his thumb finally stepped aside. We didn't resolve decades of tension in that kitchen. Some fractures are too deep to be mended with a single conversation. But something shifted. A quiet recognition. A mutual acceptance of the reality we could no longer ignore. When I left, he didn't ask me to stay. And I didn't promise to return. In the months that followed, the company recovered. Procedures tightened. Trust was slowly rebuilt. I stayed on through the transition, guiding the new leadership with steady hands, offering the wisdom that had often gone unnoticed under my father's shadow. But something in me changed. I had always measured my worth by how much I contributed to others, how much I held together, repaired, prevented. For the first time in my life, I allowed myself to be someone who didn't intervene simply because she could. Someone who understood that justice isn't vengeance. It's liberation. And I felt lighter than I had in years. Looking back now, months after the truth reshaped the life my father once controlled, I understand something I couldn't fully articulate at the time. Revenge isn't always a dramatic showdown or a sharp-edged moment of triumph. Sometimes revenge is simply stepping aside and allowing truth to do what it was always going to do. My father believed he was too important, too clever, too foundational to ever be questioned. But life has a way of leveling the ground beneath those who think they stand above consequences. His downfall wasn't my victory. It was his reckoning. What I gained wasn't satisfaction at his expense. It was clarity, distance, freedom. I learned that loyalty without accountability becomes servitude, and silence in the face of wrongdoing becomes complicity. For years, I had been the quiet buffer, absorbing the shockwaves of my father's decisions so others wouldn't have to. I had mistaken endurance for virtue and sacrifice for love. But real love, real integrity, sometimes requires stepping back, not stepping in. When I let the auditors hand him the report, I wasn't punishing him. I was choosing myself. I was choosing truth. And I was choosing a future not built on protecting someone who had relied far too long on my protection. So if there is a lesson in all of this, it's one I offer humbly, from the perspective of a woman who spent a lifetime learning it the hard way. You cannot save someone from the consequences they choose for themselves. And you should never set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm, especially when that person expects the flames to burn quietly, endlessly, without gratitude. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it walks in through the door wearing an auditor's badge. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing at all.